So Caleigh received her honors Bachelor of Bioresource Management degree in equine management from the University of Guelph in 2022. She's now a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, focusing on equine behavior and welfare. Her current research that she'll be presenting today aims to identify management practices that can help reduce stress in riding lesson horses. Caleigh has been working with horses for most of her life and is a competitive show jumper in her home province of Ontario, Canada. In her free time, she loves to help train project horses, where she gets to apply the principles of equitation science in her work and see the difference that science-based training methods can make for nervous or green horses. Caleigh hopes to help younger generations of riders connect with equitation science to continue creating a conscientious and sustainable future for the horse industry.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today, everyone. As we all know, lesson facilities are critical to the development and sustainability of the horse industry. They provide introductions for so many people into the world of horses and riding. In 2010, $400 million was spent on riding lessons in Canada, and facility owners have only been reporting continuously increasing demand for these services. 51% of Canadian stables offer riding lessons, and lesson horses make up 2.3% of the total Canadian herd. But despite how important these horses are to our industry, they face some really significant welfare challenges. Research has found that when compared to leisure horses, lesson horses demonstrate significantly higher levels of equipment-related wounds, severe vertebral issues, aggression towards humans, and stereotypic behavior. Even at rest, lesson horses rank moderately high on the horse grimace scale, and they're more likely to be seen displaying backwards ear positions or depressed-like postures, and they show pessimistic cognitive biases when compared to leisure horses. All of this suggests a reduced state of welfare in these horses, both physically and mentally. Now, this can manifest in a lot of ways, but a key concern we wanted to look at is behavior. Conflict behaviors like bucking, rearing, and bolting are often used as indicators of a horse's mental or physical state. These behaviors can arise from pain, stress, fear, restrictive tack, incorrectly applied training cues, confusion, and more. Now, these welfare challenges that I mentioned previously may put lesson horses at a higher risk for these type of behaviors than other horses. These behaviors are a problem because they can threaten rider safety and they can impact a facility's social license to operate. However, beyond conflict behaviors, we can look to positive behaviors like tactile engagement with handlers, which can be enjoyable to horses and may suggest positive feelings towards their handler. And of course, we can look to the expression of natural behaviors like allo grooming and play, and this can indicate positive states of welfare in our horses as well. What we have here is the first part of a two-phase project that seeks to better understand the impact that different management practices can have on riding lesson horses. So this first phase I'm presenting here is primarily observational. Our major objectives were to gain a better understanding of trends in lesson horse management across Canada, and then use this information to identify potential welfare concerns, risk factors for conflict behaviors, as well as management strategies that were associated with the expressions of positive behaviors in lesson horses. To do this, we put together a survey of riding lesson facilities across Canada. It had 83 possible questions that inquired about respondent, facility, and lesson horse herd demographics, horse behavior, tack use and workload, housing and nutrition, and the use of professionals and paraprofessionals on farm. Our question types were primarily multiple choice, with a few Likert scale and open-ended questions as well. Now, we distributed the survey using equine-related social media groups, email lists, and news outlets in Canada. Our respondents were required to be the owner, manager, or head coach of a Canadian riding lesson facility. At the end, we received 157 responses, which represented 1,567 working lesson horses. That's an estimated 13.4% of the total Canadian lesson herd. From there, we used univariate Monte Carlo estimates with 100,000 permutations taken from two-tailed Pearson's chi-square test to help us identify associations between our variables. Now, I will preface my results section by saying that I'm only going to be presenting some of the most key findings here because with about 10 minutes, I just don't have time to walk you through all 83 questions. But when we compared workload that they were reporting per day of their horses to the behaviors that our respondents reported seeing in their horses, we found that facilities with longer daily average workloads of over 2.5 hours per day were also reporting increased levels of horses biting their handlers and kicking out under saddle compared to those with shorter daily working averages. Now, interestingly, workload was also associated with herd size. Facilities with larger herds, which we classified here as 13 or more horses, were reporting longer maximum working hours per day for their horses, generally over 3 hours per day. But workload wasn't the only thing that herd size was impacted by. In fact, one of the most significant trends identified within our results was the impact of herd size on the behaviors that our respondents were reporting. So facilities with smaller herds of 1 to 5 horses reported lower levels of conflict behaviors and higher levels of affiliative and positive behaviors. These included horses approaching, grooming, and interacting with their handlers and making contact with them while held, engaging in interactive and object play and allo grooming, and standing quietly for grooming and tacking up. Meanwhile, facilities with larger herds of 13 or more horses reported lower levels of those positive behaviors I mentioned and higher levels of stereotypic and conflict behaviors. These included oral and locomotor stereotypies, biting handlers, pinning ears on the ground and under saddle, and bucking, bolting, and shying under saddle. Now, in both cases, medium-sized herds of 6 to 12 horses reported moderate amounts of these behaviors, which all serves to suggest an inverse relationship between positive and negative behaviors and herd size. Now, crop and spur use were also associated with increased levels of conflict behavior and reduced levels of positive behavior. 86% of facilities reported using crops in their lessons, and these facilities also reported higher levels of horses biting their handlers, pinning ears on the ground, showing reactivity when tacking up, kicking out and bucking under saddle, and lower levels of horses who stood quietly in the cross ties or groomed their handlers. 39% of facilities used spurs, and these facilities reported higher levels of oral stereotypies and lower levels of horses interacting with their handlers or demonstrating interactive play. Restrictive tack use was another factor that was associated with conflict behaviors. Facilities who used side reins reported higher levels of horses who pinned their ears on the ground or reared under saddle. Facilities who used standing martingales reported higher levels of horses performing oral stereotypies, evading rider aids, shying, and kicking out under saddle. Facilities who used flash nosebands reported higher levels of horses performing oral stereotypies, kicking out at handlers on the ground, and bolting under saddle, and lower levels of horses who voluntarily approached their handlers in the field or engaged in object play. So what do these all tell us about the management and experiences of Canadian lesson horses? Well, longer working hours were associated with conflict behaviors, which isn't particularly surprising because the longer a horse spends in a lesson, the longer they may be exposed to stressful or frustrating practices from beginner riders, and it reduces the time available to them to perform natural behaviors. Now, the fact that larger facilities reported longer working hours per horse, despite having more horses to use, can probably be attributed to the scale of a business. A facility with 50 lesson horses is probably making a majority of their income from riding lessons, versus a facility with only 4 lesson horses may be generating income from multiple streams of revenue, meaning they don't need to maximize the amount of lessons they run in the day in the same way. Now, these smaller facilities with 1 to 5 horses also reported fewer conflict behaviors and more affiliative behaviors. Since they have fewer horses to manage, it's likely that the operators of these facilities are able to just be more intimately involved with their horses' daily lives. And it's that level of individual engagement that might make it easier for them to identify and address issues sooner than a large operation might be able to. Now, one area of particular interest for us and potential concern was the very high level of crop and moderately high level of spur use reported by these facilities. Now, the fact that this equipment is so common likely means that most lesson horses are habituated to leg cues or bed to the leg. It's also possible that novice riders just don't have the strength or skill yet required to cue the horse correctly without a crop or spur. Or alternatively, as we discussed before, a lot of lesson horses are facing physical issues that could make them stiff, sore, and generally reluctant to move forward. But regardless of the reason for the use of crops and spurs, the prevalence of this equipment does raise some cause for concern. These items can be painful and aversive if they're used without skill, and they're very easily misused by novice riders. It's possible that this could have led to that increased level of conflict behavior that we saw associated with crop and spur use in lesson programs. Now, restrictive tack was also found to be associated with conflict behaviors, but in this case, we're presented with a bit of a chicken versus the egg scenario. These horses may be performing conflict behaviors as a result of the tack they're wearing, or that tack may have been put on to suppress previously expressed conflict behaviors. And we can't say for sure from survey data alone. In conclusion, our results suggest that management has the potential to reduce conflict behaviors in lesson horses. Specific risk factors we identified include facilities with larger herds, longer daily working hours, the use of crops and spurs, and the use of restrictive tack. For the next phase of our study, we'll be conducting on-farm behavioral analyses of lesson horse behavior during work. And with this next study, we hope to validate some of the results from our current study, as well as mitigate the natural limitations of survey-based data. Understanding how management drives the lived experience and subsequent behavior of lesson horses will help the lesson industry move forward in a sustainable way that preserves social license to operate, protects rider safety, and ensures a good life for lesson horses. Thank you very much. I would now be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Caleigh, for that presentation. We do have one question already in the chat. The question is, the population of 11,709 total lesson horses, how did you arrive at that total?
Absolutely. So in North America in particular, we don't have the best equine tracking and tracing systems in the world. So all of our equine population numbers are largely estimates. Canada also struggles because riding lesson facilities are actually explicitly excluded from our government's definition of what an agricultural facility is. So they are not counted in the Canadian Agricultural Census. What we do have is reports prepared by Equestrian Canada and in collaboration with different consulting firms to give our best estimates. So the 2010 industry report estimated that lesson horses made up 2.3% of the total Canadian herd of horses. And our 2023 industry report, while it didn't have any updated statistics on lesson horse numbers specifically, it did have an updated herd size, which was 509,099 horses in Canada estimated. So 2.3% of that number brought us to 11,709 horses, which is our best estimate. So that is the number that we have moved forward with.
Thanks. Another question we have is regarding the larger groups of horses, larger herds, how were they managed? I'm referring to management practices such as number of hours in stables and the rotation of herds pasture.
Absolutely. So we did not look into pasture rotation specifically. That wasn't one of our questions. We kind of had to boil down to the most significant questions that we could, because we had 83 and we were already a little concerned about our survey completion rate, which we did find to be a bit of a struggle. In terms of how the larger herds were managed, we are still pulling out some of that data. This is not yet submitted for publication. We're hoping in the next few months to have that ready. However, I can say that most of the horses were not managed largely differently from just my general overview of the data going through it myself. It was a little bit surprising, actually. It was positive to see that almost all of these facilities were reporting that their lesson horses were kept in groups. They were not doing individual turnout. Horses did not spend time in a stall 24/7. I don't believe a single facility reported not offering their horses turnout, which, is a very different setup from a show barn. So that was something I'm very interested to look into as I dig further into this data set, is the trends that we're finding and then being able to compare those to what the industry looks like right now.
Great. And one last question here. Were the lesson barns from all across Canada, east to west?
Yes, they were. So I did my level best to get this survey out to as many Canadian provinces and territories as possible. We have 11 provincial and territorial sport organizations. We do not have any for the Northwest Territories or Nunavut, but we also don't even have an estimate of how many horses are there. There's not really a big population there. So I had reached out to all of our provincial territorial sport organizations. I did not hear back from all of them, but I would say about half of them were very engaged. I went to different Facebook groups specifically targeted at equestrian activity in those provinces and territories to try to get as much response as I could. Our responses did have a bit of a strong Ontario bias, just because I had more people in my own personal network in Ontario that were helping with snowball sampling and sending this out to as many people as they could. So Ontario represented the largest number, but Ontario also has one of the largest horse communities. But yes, we did have representation from all provinces and territories in the form of at least one respondent.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Caleigh.
Thank you, everyone.